Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Region 6 MTSS Summer Conference. Thank you for joining us for our panel discussion today, presented by Cindy Dice, Dion Rivera, and Carolina Duke. Welcome to the Region 6 MTSS Summer Conference. Thank you for joining us. Sorry, I had two screens open. I apologize for that. My name is Kimberly Lepton, and I'm a part of the Region 6 Education Service Center team, and I will serve as the moderator for this presentation. Next, be sure to participate in the interactive features provided within this platform. You can post questions during the presentation, and I will ask our presenters and the panel to respond at the end of the presentation. In addition, you can vote questions to the top of the list by clicking the up arrow to the right of the question. Finally, we have social media sharing provided within this platform. Use hashtag ESC6 MTSS21 and follow the conference conversation. If you need any help or technical assistance, you can visit the help desk indicated by the question mark in the side navigation menu. And without further ado, I am going to let our lovely panelists, Cindy and Dion and Carolina, introduce themselves.
Hi, good morning. My name is Dion Rivera, and I'm the principal of Smith Elementary School in Magnolia ISD.
Hi, I'm Cindy Dice. I'm currently an early childhood specialist here at ESC 6. But previously, last year and many years before, I've been the instructional coach at Smith Elementary.
I'm Carolina Duke. I'm a bilingual instructional coach for Smith Elementary.
And personally, I know all three of these wonderful ladies, and they have created a great system at Smith Elementary School with RTI. They pretty much built it from the ground up. And so I can't wait for them to share all of their knowledge and their experiences that they've had along the way. So to start us off, tell us a little bit about just your campus in general, the demographics, and just any other great information that you would like to share about your campus.
Absolutely. So Smith Elementary, Magnolia ISD is composed of 8 elementary schools, 4 on the east side, 4 on the west side. And so Smith Elementary is on the east side of the school. We are a Title I school, and we have typically about 60 to 65% of our kids who are on free or reduced lunch. So that does, if you know about Title I kids, they are coming in already a year to even a year and a half behind. And so that's why this SST RTI process is so important because we're getting 4-year-olds and it's terrible. It's like, oh, they're already behind. What does that mean? And our campus goes pre-K through 4th grade. So, but even with our demographics, our kids are performing. And so I'm excited to talk to you about the SST process because I think being a Title I school, having that population, we are the only Title I school on the east side of Magnolia, but we still are high performing because of the process that we go through.
All right, so can you start us off with talking us through just what does the RTI process look like on your campus?
So we have RTI, and you'll hear us, the three of us, say SST a lot because in Magnolia ISD, they call this part of RTI SST, which stands for Student Success Teams. But we have a Student Success Teams committee that consists of our principal, our assistant principal, our instructional coaches, and previously we were fortunate enough to have a literacy coach, a bilingual coach, and a math coach on campus, as well as our counselor, our dyslexia specialist. So just a big group of knowledgeable people that work together to talk about our kids and their data and how they're performing and what we need. Also, we include the teachers in our SST process. They don't usually come to our meetings, but before we meet, we go to them and talk about every single student in their classroom, regardless of tier, and what their needs are and if they're growing and performing. So I feel like our SST process starts with that committee and with our teachers, and we all have like a common vision and a common goal for our school and our students, which is student success. Then from there, our big thing is being data focused so that we can be student, focused on that student success. So we have ways where we collect data from all kinds of different sources, from common formative assessments that the teachers might give, for screeners, for district summatives and DCAs. And we put all that together, and we kind of have what we call a data blast, where we put out all of the data and look for trends and for how students are performing and for areas of need.
And we also have very focused interventionists as well. So we have interventionists who are certified teachers, and then we also have instructional aides who are high quality and highly trained, who are doing that intervention with fidelity. And they report, those are always underneath an instructional coach, so that they can report back that progress, so that we need to know if that intervention is being done and how they're progressing on it.
And actually, just to add to what Dion is saying, is that most of the times instructional coaches had conversations with those interventionists before that data blast, so we can have their input, because they are the people who are serving these students directly, one-on-one and on daily basis. So we need the input not only from the teachers and the admin and coaches, but also from the people that are serving them.
And I think often a mistake is made with data. You know how people say data rich, information poor. You can have data, but you have to have data. I think for a long time, we had made the mistake of, well, I feel this. Well, I think this. And without that hard data, you are just kind of, shooting in the dark. You really need to know exactly what that student knows and skill-based wise. And that's why the interventions have to be very prescriptive. And I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later, but data and the right types of data are very important.
And I think that's kind of a change we've went through over, all the years that I worked at Smith, is trying to find that right balance of data. Like you said, the correct data, and not so much, we need anecdotal data, but not so much anecdotal data that it's just turning into feelings without that hard fact. But kind of our first step in the SST process, when we set it all up, is gathering that data. And then I think we look at it together, even when we weren't having formal meetings. Carolina and our math coach and Dion, we would come together and just look at trends and talk about it. And it helped us see kind of each kid, each classroom, each grade level, and our whole school. And then from there, we would decide, we would look at that data and try to determine what each individual kid needed, and decide if they need, if they just need to continue with tier 1 intervention, if they need some tier 2 intervention, or if they need to move to tier 3 intervention. And sometimes that could be hard, because sometimes we had a giant group of kiddos that we felt like might need a tier 3 intervention, but we might not have enough people to serve them. And so it's really looking at what we could also do in tier 2 and tier 1 to kind of support those kids too. When the kiddos, we decided they needed to be tier 2 intervention, then that was served in the classroom.
Through that data gathering, we also found out in some cases discrepancies between the data and the anecdotal notes. Mm-hmm. So that's where Cindy, she says is adding that that piece of not only what you see in the classroom, because sometimes we see a student that is struggling, or a student that may seem not to struggle in the classroom as a general population student, but when that student takes the assessment, So that student is not being successful. So through that data digging, we could find those patterns and those specific students that where they show discrepancy between what they are able to do and what they were performing. So that was really interesting to see that how we could find where our gaps were happening for those few students.
I think we saw that a lot too, especially in the last few years, where a kid, and even the inverse, where sometimes teachers would think a kid was doing really poorly and needed a lot of intervention, and then we would start digging through their data, and they were performing at or above grade level in most areas. And so that led us with a lot of conversations at the at the individual teacher, the individual student level, about what does that kiddo need? Because if they're being successful on assessments, but they're not being successful in the classroom, we might need to look at some of our, what's happening in the classroom that may be leading to that lack of success. And so in this way, I think we were able to use data with the anecdotal data to really kind of service the whole kid, not just academics, but what may be going on emotionally or socially, or something that is keeping them from being as successful as they could.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you collected the data? You talk about the anecdotal data, and then as well as the data within your whatever program the student is in. Can you tell us about how that is collected and how you summarize that data?
So we collect data in a whole bunch of ways. First and foremost, when we started working through our PLC process, which we know that everything in our school system works together, PLC and everything. When we started working through our PLC process to create common formative assessments and those kinds of assessments, we put them into our data program, which is Eduphoria at Magnolia ISD. And so when teachers created assessments, they were also created, recording documents and such, that we were able to put that data in there. So that is one way that we were able to keep really hard track of data. And a lot of our screener data and district data was also uploaded into the same platform. So it made it really easy for us to kind of run reports about the data. But I'll let Carolina tell you a little bit more about our spreadsheets and that kind of stuff, because she is queen of collecting data across the entire year.
So one thing that we all developed was simple spreadsheets. It's something very simple. Everybody could have access to it. So every team had a set of spreadsheets per teacher. So, and those sheets were divided, like the teacher had all the formative assessments and summative assessments, and every assessment was linked to one of the TICs or the standards that they were assessed. Since we have that PLC model, and they had to decide exactly what are those essential standards that they have to assess, so they could really tell which questions they were asking, which standard were they taught, and also how did that child perform exactly in that area. Because in an assessment, you can basically present a child with 5 different standards or 4, let's say we usually do 3 at the most, but I know some people may do 3 to 5. So let's say that they assess 3 essential standards. So maybe the child is really strong in one of the areas, and but is very weak in one of the standards. So why to remediate on a child in an area that he doesn't need to? So this way they could really dissect where the needs were for each one of their students. So since we can use filters, and I'm getting a little technical on that, but we can use filters to see how the kids were moving along the way, and if a student was maintaining that weakness in one of the standards that were reassessed later, then we needed to provide those teachers or that teacher with instructional strategies and instructional ideas to help improve that specific area in their classroom.
And these,
So I'm going to jump in right there because that's where it starts with your tier 1 instruction.
Yes, exactly.
Cindy. And when you're creating those assessments as a team based on the standards, you need to code each question by the standard. And then even if it's immensely helpful, even, in the younger grades, if you have the capabilities of making it a Scantron test, because then you can scan that into Eduphoria and it will break down by TEAC where the strengths are. I mean, you can do it by hand as well, but it's really important that tier 1 code your questions by standard.
And these spreadsheets that we would have for tier 1, literally you would see every assessment that was given that year by standard, and even screeners and reading levels, and you could see the progression of a kiddo, and they're very, very powerful and that tier 1 level to see. And also when we start talking later on about progress monitoring and looking for student growth, those same spreadsheets will help you see which students are stagnant and which students are making some growth and which students are making amazing growth, which we were able to see a lot through the years, and those were, huge areas of celebration. But I really do think that our entire SST process on our campus started with tier 1 data and keeping really strong. And it was a learning process. I think every year our spreadsheets got different and better, and we would collaborate them a little bit more. At first, I think it was Carolina creating some and me creating some and Tiffany creating some, and then by the end we were like, wait, let's merge all this together so we can get an idea of the whole child. And it really did give us that.
And Cindy, something that we kind of evolved into was also that usually we could maintain good data for comprehension skills.
Yes.
But in the last few years, we added that foundational skills component that, like 5 years ago for us, it was almost impossible, or in our minds, impossible to assess and keep track of. And having these tools that are so simple, it could, like you say, show the progression of the student all in one place, but also in all areas, not only comprehension areas, because those are the easiest to assess, but also those foundational skills.
Yeah, those foundational skills can feel overwhelming to keep track of the data. But with us starting doing that, I think this past year was when we did the most. And I think we also saw the most growth, especially in K1-2 with our lowest students when we started tracking that data.
And for foundational skills, that's where the running records and anecdotal notes versus the hard data really come into play. So if you're looking at this big picture, like how am I going to plan this, your teachers would want to, really go through that PLC process where, 3 weeks before the unit starts, they're looking at the whole unit, they're breaking down their essential standards, they're writing their summative assessment, and then they're putting 2 to 3 common formative assessments. And so they can check by standard all the way where their student gaps are.
That's right. It's very powerful.
So as you guys talk about, needing that strong tier 1 instruction, you've collected that data, summarized that data, gotten that teacher input, and let's say you decide to, that a student needs tier 2 supports. What types of interventions, because I know this is one strength is in Magnolia ISD, is that you really have defined what constitutes tier 2 interventions versus tier 3. So can you talk to us a little bit about what are your tier 2 interventions, and then also as a student may need a tier 3, what would that look like as they moved into tier 3?
So for tier 2 interventions, typically that is intervention that's given by a classroom teacher. They keep track of that data, and they even have some autonomy to decide what intervention is going to be given, as long as they're using a program that's evidence-based and is hitting the standards that they need to keep track on. They just have to keep track of it. And the way we kept track of it this year, and this is, I think, still a little bit of an area of growth for us, But the way we started doing it last year was that they had small group planning sheets for those tier 2 kiddos. And they planned which standards they're going to be hitting, which evidence-based program are they going to use, how much, how many times are they going to meet, and all of those things that we think about when we think about intervention, so that we can provide it with fidelity. And then those teachers, those tier 2 kiddos have to also be progress monitored. And that is something that in our lower grades, it was easy for progress monitoring because we did it with our same screener that we used beginning, middle, and end of the year for foundational skills screener. So we were able to use that to progress monitor our interventions. As they get older, I think it gets a little bit more difficult in tier 2 to think about that progress monitoring, but it's an essential part. I think, and I don't know how you guys feel, but a couple of years ago, we started doing intervention block, and I think that's district-wide, that every school has a 30-minute intervention block. And I think that revolutionized tier 2 interventions, because what we found is that when it's not COVID year, this year was a little bit crazy, but teachers can use that data to determine kids who have same areas of need, and they can switch their kids around, and each teacher can be provided a tier 2 intervention for even bigger than a small group. They might have a whole class group that they're giving intervention to during that intervention block. What else did I miss, guys?
Well, that is also utilizing the strength of the teachers, because
Exactly.
when you use that tier 2 intervention time to collaborate among all the teachers, so you use someone that is really strong, let's say in an area of comprehension, so all the students that are weak in that area go to that teacher. But I also wanted to add that that was the time, the tier 2 intervention was a time where we use some of the computer-based programs also as one of the tier 2 interventions.
Because, your tier 2 kids, they're the ones that they just need that little bit of push. And so that's why our teachers really take ownership of that, because if they've been tracking that student correctly, they know exactly what skills or standards that they're working on. And they need to, it takes discipline, and that's something that we're real tight on. Is it's not going to happen overnight, and you can't just try something new every time you're meeting with that child. You have to give it. I mean, there's a reason that we do our SST meetings every 6 weeks, because it takes some time to get that student sometimes to click.
I think sometimes that's the hardest part for teachers when you're talking about tier 2 intervention, is that adherence to one program with fidelity. We know that if we don't do something with fidelity, we can't say it's working or not. And so giving kids a solid program with fidelity through an intervention cycle, which for us is typically 6 weeks, that helps us really know if kids are being successful or not. Tier 2 intervention, tier 2 in the RTI or SST, I think is one of the hardest area to really keep track of the data and to make sure that we're moving kids, because we definitely don't want to have a kid start in tier 2 and not provided high quality intervention with progress monitoring, and then them not make progress and have to go backwards a little bit.
Trying to help with that tier 2
So-
intervention. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. You're good.
Trying to help teachers with that tier 2 intervention, because as Cindy is saying, that's one of the hardest ones, because sometimes we move from skill to skill, it is not consistent, or the program that we use is not consistent. So trying to help teachers with that, we provided extensions that came with the reading program that the district uses. So we actually Cindy dug through it pretty good, and then I added the bilingual component to it. But we provided teachers with binders where they had interventions provided by that program that we use in the district, and all teachers have access to it, but in a way that they can access it easily in the classroom, that they could understand it, because it was kind of complicated to find and then to pull exactly what they need, but we provided those resources for them.
Exactly.
Okay, and then lastly, just moving up to that tier 3. So y'all talked about the tier 2 interventions. So let's say a student did not meet your expected growth, and you decided to move them into tier 3. Who would provide the interventions, and then what interventions would be used there?
So I'll just go back to something that Cindy talked about earlier. If you're a school leader, it is very important that it goes to your master schedule first. We started with a 30-minute intervention block because you don't want kids who need help to be pulled away from the instruction. And this year we have expanded our intervention block to 45 minutes in our master schedule. So if you don't have that time built in, I highly recommend that you do that.
Well, and this past year, I think this was our second or third year we did intervention block, but we did something that was even more powerful where everyone who was able to give intervention, and for us, we have some tutors that Dion was able to hire for our school. We have some instructional paraprofessionals that we heavily train and equip them to give some interventions. And this past year, even the instructional coaches were going in during a couple of grade levels intervention blocks and providing intervention. So all these people flooded each grade level's intervention block. So for example, in first grade, we had, I think, probably 4 people able to give English intervention and maybe 2 more that were able to give bilingual intervention. And we all went to that grade level during intervention block. And the kids who needed tier 3 intervention were pulled out into any single space we could find in the school, maybe a closet, maybe something, but those kids were pulled out. Then the kids who remained in the classroom that were tier 2 would get shuffled around to their tier 2 intervention spots. And then the other kids were involved in some kind of project-based learning, or maybe getting to, have some free choice on some of our educational programs and those kinds of things. And so for tier 3, the kiddos came out and they would go work with the interventionist. This worked very much the same as tier 2, except for, I think, Carolina, Tiffany, and I had a lot more control over the interventions that were being delivered, and a lot more kind of overwatching the groups and the people that are delivering the intervention.
I mean, it's truly like if you were going to a doctor, I mean, these are our specialists. Your tier 3 cases are your most serious cases. And so
Yeah.
you needed your instructional specialist overseeing what they were doing and monitoring those kids.
So a big part of what I did last year, and I know what Carolina did too, is looking constantly at that tier 1 data. And we'll talk a little in a minute about progress monitoring and the data that we got from our actual interventions, but constantly looking over those 2 sources of intervention to make sure that our kids who were in tier 3 intervention were showing some growth. And then if we noticed whole groups not getting growth, then we had to start looking at, are the kids not growing? Is the program not being used with fidelity? I know we had one problem last year, and this was just in the land of COVID, where we had teachers out on quarantine, and one of our paras was getting pulled every time. And so that one group was missing a lot of intervention. And that was just an easy little shift to where it stunk, but then we would just alternate the pairs getting pulled. So maybe you have 4 groups missing 1 intervention in a week versus 1 group missing a whole week's of intervention. But that's kind of the oversight that we had into tier 3. And those programs that we used for intervention were a lot more scripted and more rigid, where you started one place and went on. The district had a bunch that we can choose from. Some of them were focused on comprehension. Especially in the older grades, we have a lot of kids who would be focused on a skill or comprehension. And then in our younger grades through 2nd and even some 3rd, we had a lot of kids who were focused on foundational skills and kind of bridging those gaps so that they can learn to read at the word level. before they went on. So I'm sorry.
Anybody else want to add to what Cindy said? No. Okay. What I hear you guys.
Just
Oh, go ahead.
Just that it's so important to have a really good diagnostic or someone who can get in there and see exactly what they need. You know, for a couple of years, you know, it was all about, we use for comprehension LLI, and that's a great intervention for comprehension skills. And that's what Cindy mentioned earlier, is we were missing the shot. And so we would, you know, be getting these kids so much intervention. Why aren't they growing? Why aren't they growing? It's because we weren't giving them the correct intervention. And so that's so important that you are focusing on the right things.
Yeah, and then I think too, especially when you have people giving intervention that are not certified teachers, but even when you do, like a lot of our tutors were all certified teachers, but having that time, and I tried really hard, like once a week, for us all to come together, me and the people delivering the intervention, and just having a check-in and concerns and questions and how can I support you, exactly like if I would be coaching a classroom teacher, but working those same kinds of things with the interventionists was really powerful. And I think it helped up the fidelity of what was happening in our tier 3 interventions.
One more thing that we started doing more consistently this year was to add those interventionists and interventionist aides to the training, because if they are the people delivering the interventions, they need to understand the programs, they need to understand how to add to what the teacher feedback is giving them, because many times they speak directly with the teacher when they go pick up the students from their classrooms, when they drop the students, and the teachers tell them exactly like, hey, we're doing this. So we're giving them the tools little by little. We have to keep working on that, but we started doing it with more consistency, that delivering instruction in the programs, and also helping them understand how they can maintain the fidelity with the program, but also adding what the students are needing, like right now in the classroom.
I think that speaks to a huge and important need that we have too in all areas, but especially with these aides who might be paraprofessionals, is it's not enough to just know a program. We try really hard to build capacity just about instruction, about how a kid learns to read, or how a kid learns to do math. So more than just learning a program, because if you don't know the why behind it, it's really hard to support that kid's learning.
So a question came into the chat. Could you talk about your tier 3 math programs?
So this is a growth area for us, because math is really hard. In our district, we are now going to start using a program called Think Through Math as a diagnostic. Yeah, this sounds terrible, but you know, in the past, our tier 3 intervention for math has been put them on this computer program for 30 minutes. And that's just terrible. And so this year, and we've, you know, discussed that with our district leaders, and so they are aware there's a lot of things happening with math. So this year they are going to be looking at getting a better diagnostic, using Think Through Math program as a diagnostic, so that you can see exactly where those gaps are. I've also been doing a lot of research on accelerated learning versus remediation. And what the research will tell you is that if you pre-teach a child and do accelerated learning, that the benefits and outcomes of that are so much better than remediation. So in math, a lot of it might be pre-teaching some skills in that tier 3 time, so that when they get to the tier 1 time when it's being taught, that they're like, they have some familiarity with it. But tier 3 math is something that that's a growth area for us, definitely, because it is, those skills build on each other, and they always don't spiral like they do with ELA. And so finding a very good diagnostic, and then, but it does still go back to tracking the standards. And you have to know exactly what skill that student is struggling with.
I think one thing.
Go ahead, Carolina.
One thing that I know Tiffany is not here to speak for math, But one thing that we try to do at the end of the year, and basically to cover those needs, maybe a little late in the year, but it was to divide the time, since most of the times those tier 3 students that need math intervention, most likely they need reading intervention, and usually reading comes above math most of the time because they need to learn to read. But one thing that we did towards the end of the year was to divide that time. So Monday through Wednesday, they receive reading intervention, and then Thursdays and Fridays, I wasn't too happy because they were not getting the interventions in reading, but then Thursdays and Fridays, they deserve that intervention time in math. So that's something that maybe if it happened with more consistency, maybe that could help, just to help with the answer of the
And that's why the interventionists have to be highly skilled, because they have to be able to switch, just like a teacher, between reading and math, and being able to really get down to the nitty gritty of where is the gap for both of the subjects.
And so we haven't talked a lot about this yet, but a huge integral part of any SST process on your campus is, in addition to tracking that tier 1 data, is your progress monitoring data. And so as you're thinking about tier 3 intervention specifically, when you deliver the intervention, you have to plan how are you going to progress monitor. And on our campus, we tried the kiddos would need to have some type of progress monitoring every 2 weeks. And then we track that data. And we were able to keep track of that data in Eduphoria, but also on our spreadsheets. We had a tier 3 and a tier 2 spreadsheets within our SST, and we kept track of that data so that we could see how kids are growing. Progress monitoring is a huge part of SST, and it's also one of the hardest things to decide what progress monitoring probes or how you're going to progress monitor consistently, especially when you're talking in the lower grades where you're progress monitoring a specific skill. That's where you can take advantage of using your screener programs. I know that across the state in K-2, there's a list of, early reading skills screeners that most school districts are using. A lot of those will have progress monitoring capabilities with them, and they're very easy to do, and it gives you very accurate and sustainable data. And that's what we did last year, and it made a humongous difference. So we actually used Amplify M-Class as our screener, and that we did, beginning, middle, end of the year with kinder first and second. And then every 2 weeks, the kids were progress monitored with a subtest from that platform. If they had phonological issues, they might take the nonsense word reading screener and then the phoneme segmentation screener. So in each of those tests are 2 minutes. So every 2 weeks, 2 minutes of their intervention is doing a little assessment, and we are able to see really quickly if they grow. Also, any program that you use like that, a lot of them, if you dig around, it's a trial and error. I know Caroline and I spent a lot of time in M-Class last year in the English side and the Spanish side, finding goals that you can set for the kids through there, and ways that you can keep that data and progress monitor. And we were able to see at a glance how kids are doing. And so kind of once we go through our Dion talked earlier about how we stick with the interventions for 6 weeks. So every 6 weeks, we try to sit and have an SST meeting. And then that's where we pull out that data. We look at the tier 1 data because we always talk about that, but also we look at the tier 2 and tier 3 data, and then we decide any kind of tier movement that we need. And this is kind of when it can get exciting, because we would come in, we always know ahead of time, this kid, we get to move them from tier 3 to tier 2. And that was always huge celebration. Occasionally we were able to move them from tier 3 with that focused intentional intervention all the way to with tier 1, with the asterisk that we were going to keep watching them to make sure that they were staying successful. But those were always really huge moments for us. So
Thank you so much for sharing. So you guys have been on this journey for quite a while together. And I know you've seen lots of changes. Y'all have mentioned a few of them as you've been talking so far. But tell us a little bit more. I heard earlier you talking about how you go to the teachers before you actually meet. So I know that was a change that you guys have made. Just tell us a little bit about how those changes have come about and the impact that it's had on y'all's RTI process.
So years ago, I would describe our RTI process as long and painful.
exactly.
Teachers would have morning meetings and they would, talk about their kids, and then it's no exaggeration, then the RTI committee would meet for 1 to 2 days just talking about kids. And it was, because we're educators, we get in this because we're passionate. We don't get in this because we love data, it's because we love kids. And so we would start talking about our kids, and our kids did this, and this is what happened at home. And that would drag on for a long time. So then we're like, all right, we got to get this better. And so then we started having RTI meetings, and we were only looking at the data that teachers had submitted or that was in Euphoria and making decisions based on that. But then we took the teacher out too much. And so, we were just swinging too wide. So then we decided, okay, we need to train the teachers on first keeping the great data, and then they're going to come in, we're going to meet with them. I'm so sorry. We're going to meet with them, and we're going to have them present to us how their kids are doing, but in a data focused way. So it's like, yes, we love your kids, we know you love them, but let's look at how they're performing. And so we really had to get tight on that agenda of here's the information you're going to present to us. And we were able to meet with every teacher for about 10 or 15 minutes, gather their data. They gave us everything that we wanted to know. And then we would spend a couple of days, 2 to 3 days doing that. And then we would have our SST meeting. And again, we're just looking at data so we can go through this very quickly without having to spend 10 minutes talking per child about their situation. We were only looking at whether or not they're making progress and why. How is it going?
And something that I noticed a change is that instead of talking about what we cannot control in the child's life, is what are we doing for them? And exactly, we move past that meeting the child in the small group table at the back of the room to what exactly are you doing during that tier 2 intervention time. So that gave us more concrete information about what was happening and why the child wasn't progressing.
I think another huge change that we went through in the last couple of years too is using that progress monitoring data to not just move kids through tiers, but to change intervention when needed. There in the past, we might have one kid receiving the same intervention for 2 full years and not showing any growth before we decided, hey, maybe this is not the best, intervention for them. And so now we give them, 6 solid weeks of instruction with, intervention with fidelity that's, monitored and everything. And if they're not showing growth, we need to look at why and what changes we can make for that kiddo. And that's made a huge difference as well. And I think it's helped us shift from this idea, when I first started, this idea that RTI is just a pathway to a special education diagnosis. And I think that was kind of the belief that was held by a lot of people. Well, this kid needs tested, but they need to have intervention first or whatever. But now I think that intervention on our campus always, is genuinely about how can we help this kiddo be successful? How can we meet them where they are and give them the tools so that they're going to be successful in their, educational career?
Yeah, and Cindy, you nailed it. I was going to say it was a cultural shift. And you have to celebrate those small wins because, and it's empowering to teachers. It's like, no, you're that child's teacher. We are not going to take this child and throw them out in tier 3 and it's somebody else's problem. If you're a first grade teacher, these are your 20 kids and we're going to do whatever we can to get them moving. And so when teachers were empowered to take over and not just give it away, and they could see the progress that was made when you are doing an intervention with fidelity and keeping great data, that will change your entire RTI process right there when your teacher can see. And then the kids can see that them reaching their goals as well.
I see it like we went from being reactive to being proactive.
Exactly.
Because in the past, we just let things sit there, like Cindy said, for 2 years, the same intervention, and the child wasn't growing. So now every 6 weeks, we had our alarm set to check all the information that we had on that child or that group of children, and then either changing the child from the group, or because that also happens, sometimes the students stay too long with the same group and some of them may be excelling and then they are staying behind because they're staying in the same group. So we move students around. We also change tiers, but also change interventions. And if the interventions were not facilitated, like ready for us to use, we created them because based on those research-based programs, we created pathways for teachers in conjunction with the dyslexia teacher to create some intervention time that it was consistent on research-based and to change it from what the student already proved that wasn't being successful on. So that it's really nice to see that we change our attitude towards the RTI process.
Also, I think too, something you said made me think about this, Carolina, that I feel like the intervention used to be a bunch of separate islands, and then it truly is a collaborative process now. We would be eating lunch and talking about, we have this need, this need, this need, and our dyslexia specialist would be like, oh, we can try this and we can try this, and truly a collaborative culture that those programs and those conversations, they didn't just help our intervention, they grew all of our capacity and content knowledge. And I feel like the teachers feel the same way, with the tier 2 interventions that we gave them. They would come to us and like, oh, I didn't even know this. So in addition to providing their kids with quality intervention, they're growing their content knowledge at the same time.
So in addition to your teachers being involved, your interventionists being involved, and you guys, how do you incorporate families into this whole RTI process?
Well, talking about families just makes my heart happy. So, it goes back to the culture of your school. And I love Dr. Karen Mapp. She wrote a book years ago that many of you probably have heard of before called Beyond the Bake Sale. And so you have to go, I always say that the parent is the child's first teacher. And you have to go back to how are you utilizing your parents beyond bake sales and carnivals. And, our parents want the best for their kids, but sometimes they don't know the skills. And so what we do on our campus, we have something called academic parent teacher team meetings, and we actually teach the teachers the most basic skills that are essential skills that their children will need. And we actually give them tools and training on how to help their kids at home. So you're going to equip them that way. But the parents are essential. And every year I tell the staff this very quick story of, it was around April in a school year. And I had a mom come up and she was moving here and she had a first grader. She was going to be starting in April. And I was walking that parent around and I said, well, has she any, first grader? She got to be a reader. And I said, do you know how she's doing in her reading? What is her reading level? Is she in any reading intervention? And the mom had no idea. And this was a very sweet mom who was very involved with her kids, but she didn't know. And it was after the very first day that child had started in the classroom and the teacher came up and said, she needs help right now. And this is a child who needed serious reading intervention. And the mom, who was so sweet and involved, had no idea that her child had a reading deficit. And so I tell our staff, I never want a parent to leave our school and not know the strengths and weaknesses of their child and where they can be helping. And so our parents are our first phone call, as far as, hey, here's what we're seeing. But they are aware throughout the process. And we don't just want to say, hey, your kid isn't on track. Here's what we're doing. But it's like, here's what you can also do. And if you have any questions, so you have to utilize your parents because they want to help it, and don't let them be in the dark. Because also, let's say you get down the road and suddenly it might be a sped referral. That's going to come and bite you real quick when a parent is very upset of, oh, suddenly my kid, you're saying they might have a disability when I didn't even know. So you have to utilize them.
And I know it was even more involved than me. I was involved in the bilingual side of it, but we, through the SST process, we communicated to the parents how the students were progressing in their tier 3 groups. And teachers, once they moved to tier 3, teachers had to contact the parents. We had to keep that information uploaded into Edu4 as well, and keep track of all those communications with the parents. So it was very consistent, the communication with families.
And I think that documentation side of it was kind of new for us the last couple of years. We sent notes home at the beginning, when initial notes, whenever we decided to have a child be on a tier, and those got a phone call and a note sent home. And we actually kept copies of those letters and uploaded them into Eduphoria for every kid who was on tier 3. And then every time we had an SST meeting, whatever decision was made about that child, we sent another letter home. And if teachers had time, I would prefer a phone call too at each check-in, because it just helps empower the parent, helps them know what to ask, how to help. And it just lets them know about their life of their kiddo at school. And like Dion said, they are their first teacher, and they have a lot of power and time to be able to spend with them if we empower them and support them to do that.
All right, so a question came in the chat. Have you given any thought to the House Bill 4545 and how that may impact your intervention times, or will it change what you're currently doing?
So the good thing is, I feel like we have already been doing a lot of those things that go with House Bill 4545, where we have to guarantee that we're going to be helping a child who has not been successful. With House bills and anything with the legislature, it might be a little bit more, paperwork, a little bit more document keeping, but I feel like we've already set up some pretty good systems that House Bill 45, the purpose of that is to have schools set up these systems if they didn't have them already. And so I think it is necessary. And so that's something that we're discussing at the district right now, is how that will look. I think it's just, it's just making sure that our checks and balances and documentation is where we need it to be.
Thank you. So when we think about RTI, the focus is usually on the students that are in need of intervention. So how does the RTI process on your campus affect the Tier 1 instruction?
Well, we talked a lot at the beginning of how we really start with Tier 1 data and look at it. One of the things that we've kind of noticed through this time is sometimes you look at data, especially when you're looking at by standard, and you've seen 90% of our kids, fall into the approaches or did not meet category for that standard. Well, to us, that doesn't speak of a need for intervention. That speaks to a need for some Tier 1 instructional tweaks. And as coaches, that's a time that we could go into classrooms, kind of observe what's going on, and then see how we can support the grade level with that standard. Let's look at how it's being taught. Maybe we were not teaching it to the complexity that it needed it, or something like that. And so then we're able to support that in the tier 1 setting versus giving intervention to 90% of a grade level, which we know is not going to be effective or really attainable. Also, I think, go ahead, Carolina.
I'm sorry.
I'm probably going to say the same thing.
You reminded me of something during tier 1 instruction that I think is really powerful, and is that we have used the video coaching for teachers to video the exact same lesson on a standard that they may not feel comfortable teaching. So if you have 6 people, it doesn't matter the language. So the nice thing is that we had people teaching in Spanish and showing their outcomes, and people teaching in English to the Spanish speakers. So we had all 6, 7 teachers teaching the exact same lesson and then providing feedback on each other. And coaches, we also giving that feedback on their lessons. So we all could get a growth area, but also something good that we can take and apply in our classrooms.
Yeah, your school has to be really great about that PLC process and that collective inquiry and that's why they're called common formative assessments, because you're all going to give the same assessment at the same time. And then you're going to really compare your scores, because it's always in relation to what this is. And then you're going to see who did great and why, and then share that with each other. And that is really how you get the best tier 1. And then with video, seeing exactly what everyone is doing.
All right. So knowing that tier 1 instruction, you guys are going in and really, looking at what's happening within the classroom. You guys also mentioned that RTI process impacted your PLCs. Can you tell us about that?
Well, they go hand in hand. They are connected, because you are, planning your lessons, and then we do a 48-hour data turnaround. So if you're getting any type of assessment, ideally it's an exit ticket or something like that at the end of your lesson, and then you have immediate data. And so you're not waiting until 3 weeks when you have this summative test to intervene. You are intervening the next day or 2 days at the latest, and you're constantly catching those kids. And so it's not such a big issue by the time you start intervening. You're going to catch them early.
Yeah, at this point, I don't see RTI and PLC separate at all. It has to be interconnected because it feeds into each other. If a child is already, every student is in a tier, beginning with that. So, and PLC is taking care of tier 1 instruction, but then also supporting that tier 2 interventions that the teachers have to provide. And I put a quick example. If the teacher, through the team meetings during the PLC, our campus is a PLC campus, so she comes and observes the data and says, well, I didn't do well in this standard, or my students are staying behind in these foundational skills. So all the teachers and coaches and admin collaborate with that teacher to give feedback on how to improve instruction. Maybe it was the assessment, maybe it's a misunderstanding on what the standard is stating. So this is the moment where she can get that feedback and then go back and apply to her classroom in a tier 1 instruction. Now, tier 3 is providing also information for the teachers to see how the student is progressing or not, so she can really help that student throughout that intervention of tier 2 time, or when she's going to meet in addition to the tier 3 pull out with those students to remediate and help in those areas. So it goes hand in hand.
Very good. To wrap us up, what advice would you have to any campus that is beginning this RTI process, or maybe wanting to change things up? What advice could you give?
Just first of all, I would, focus on the whole why we are here. You're not just here just to get up there and teach and then, go on. It's a real cultural shift to a focus on the learning versus the focus on the teaching. And so when you can make that shift and really have your teachers reflect on, did this student learn it? And if they didn't, what are we going to do about it? I think it starts right there in that shift.
I think too, kind of realizing that RTI is not separate from the other things you do on your campus. PLC, RTI, your tier 1 instruction, any other campus initiatives, they all kind of work together to create successful students. And when you start to think about it as not something that, we have to do this, but instead it's a way to grow kids, I think that little shift too helps us utilize the whole process with the goal in mind, which is student growth and success.
I would say start small and not try to cover so much at the first year at once, because then it's discouraging, and just celebrate those little moments of success throughout, that whole process, and pick the next thing that you're going to work on.
And like from the mechanic side, because kind of we talked about all big ideas. I think one of the things that were powerful to us is when we sat down and said, okay, first we're going to meet to look at the data. Next, we're going to do this. Next, we're going to do this. Creating like a, 4-step little thing that really outlines how you're going to run your, RTI process on your campus, how you're going to run your meetings. I think that takes some of the giant big picture and brings it down to something that's more doable and gives a starting spot to take on from there.
Yeah, and triage it. Focus on your most high needs as well. Like, hey, we're going to get really great at tier 3 reading. Okay, now let's move the next year to tier 2, this and that. And so like we said, our tier 2 and then our tier 3 math is what we're working on now.
Awesome.
Just like you guys suggested with your kids, those little bitty bites, do the same thing for yourself.
Exactly.
Yes. Awesome. Well, many, many thanks to Cindy and Dion and Carolina for all of your expertise and knowledge in the RTI process. I appreciate you guys a lot. Thank you. Before we close, I want to point your attention to a couple of items. Below, there is a session feedback link with a survey. We would appreciate your help in completing the survey so that we may continue to grow in our practice. Finally, the recording of this session will be added to the presentation session when it becomes available. And any handouts or resources will be listed underneath the document section, and those can be downloaded at any time. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.